Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, where my co-hosts David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy versus Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.substack.com to register for our updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. Climate finance is an emerging field that aims to harness the power of finance for climate change mitigation and adaptation. On today's show, we'll explore how the world of finance is helping or hindering the global transition to low-carbon energy. In particular, we look at the effect it is having on Canada's oil and gas sector. To help us, we're joined today by special guest Keith Forman. Keith has been both a financier to the hydrocarbon industry and a CFO within the industry, including for Crestwood Midstream Partners, El Paso Corporation, and Gulf Terra Energy Partners. His latter career included senior roles in a biodiesel business and an industrial wood pellet manufacturer. Currently, Keith is a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellow, through which he tackles climate change. Now on to the show. I'm going to open just with a very quick story. In July of 2019, I was in London, England, and back when international travel was still a thing. I was there to help run a week-long course called a masterclass in transition hosted by an NGO that I co-founded called ASI Canada. For that class, we invited Mark Campanale, who is the founder of Carbon Tracker, to speak to the students. And if you don't know Mark, you probably know the term carbon bubble, which he coined. So he said a couple of things that relate to today's topic that have stayed with me ever since. One, he quoted a Bob Dylan lyric, "While money doesn't talk, it swears." And I'll leave it to the Dylan aficionados to figure out which song that appeared in. And two, he said, generally, if you're interested in social change, the last place you look is finance. Well, in our Energy versus Climate series, it wasn't the first place we looked. It's the 9th, but it does seem to be one that's growing in importance. So today we're going to explore how the world of finance is helping or hindering the global transition to low carbon energy and what effect it's having on Canada and particularly Canada's oil and gas sector. And to do that, in addition to David, Sara, myself, we're joined today by a special guest, Keith Forman. And Keith has a great background for today's discussion. He's been a financier to the hydrocarbon industry, including to Canadian midstream players like TC Energy and Enbridge. And hello to people from those two companies who seem to enjoy tuning into Energy versus Climate. Keith has also worked directly in the midstream sector for what was then the largest pipeline company in the world, El Paso. But he's also worked for a couple of biomass platforms, one in biodiesel, the other in wood pellets, and in one case, he was sent in by the private equity firm Blackstone Capital to get ROI on its $250 million investment, which he successfully did. Now, Keith is an advanced Harvard Leadership Initiative Fellow, through which he collaborates with a cadre of social change agents working on everything from childhood obesity to urban poverty to climate change. Keith, give us an extra 30 seconds on the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative program, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I will. The thesis behind it's been around for 12 years is that it's Taoist and Hindi and Buddhist in that your life is divided into thirds, where you're a child and nurtured by your family and the community through education. And then you go out and make your mark on the world, hopefully in a good way. But then in the third phase of your life, you enter a phase of wisdom, where you become an educator and a sharer of your experiences for the benefit of others. And as is pointed out to all of us in the room, much to our disappointment, that no Nobel Prize winner ever won an award for work that they did after the age of 43. So get off our 60-year-old asses and start doing the right thing and not trying to change the world by inventing something new. So.
Well, that's great. Well, welcome. And we're grateful for you sharing your experiences with us and our Energy versus Climate audience today. So Without any further ado, let's dive in. Let's launch our pre-poll. So our pre-poll in 2019, Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance declared that finance is not going to solve climate change, but it has a critical role to play in supporting the real economy through the transition. So when it comes to Canada's oil and gas industry, the climate finance movement will be a plus. And by that, it will cause capital to flow into the sector because our Canadian companies are taking energy transition seriously. Or the climate finance movement will be a negative. It will cause capital to flow out of the sector because our sector is too carbon intensive. Or the climate finance movement won't have a material impact on climate flows. All right. Responses are flowing in. Let's open up the discussion. So if transition is ultimately about turning over our capital stock from high carbon to low carbon, and that's across buildings, power, transportation, fuels, etc., then what is climate finance and what is its role in promoting that turnover? And especially, what is its role in promoting that capital stock turnover relative to just government regulation forcing the turnover? Does it have an impact, or is it a bunch of hype, or even a distraction away from pressuring governments to introduce those rules? So we're going to start with Sara, and Sara's going to open by also helping to define climate finance as a field. So over to you, Sara.
Thanks, Ed. So, climate finance obviously is a huge field. So I thought I would at least just pick up on a few things that I think about when I think about climate finance. So one obviously is the divestment movement and the idea of, putting pressure on companies and individuals and investors to divest from higher carbon sources of energy. A related, but I think slightly different version of climate finance in the discussion is one around climate risk and how companies and investors are taking into account climate risk, both physical risk from climate, so how a changing climate will impact businesses, but also transition risk, which is really how we might run into the risk essentially of stranded assets or companies that are not positioned to be successful in a low carbon future. And then overlaid really in a sense across both of those are various different metrics. So, we talk a lot about ESG metrics. There's a big growth in different ways of measuring the climate performance of different companies. And so, when I go back to your question then of what is the potential role of climate finance and the role of government, I see it as really sort of a back and forth. It's sort of, on the one hand, I think that there is, and what we've seen is the divestment movement and that sort of early push can pick up some attention. And really, while I don't think it necessarily makes a big impact on the flows of capital and availability of capital, it can get people to look at the issue and really force action. Then I think you have a big sort of role for finance in the middle around that transition risk, where you start to see flows that are moving because they're adjusting to that risk. And then actually, I think at the very end, I have the cynical view that there's going to be some investors out there that are willing to put money into things as long as they see some chance of making a return, even if they're very high carbon. And so I think you pick up a little bit again with that divestment, whether it's pressure from the outside or from governments that sort of move you away from that last little bit of remaining investment in a given high carbon sector. So I think it's climate finance has a significant role to play. I don't think it can do it on its own, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not impactful. So I'll maybe stop there, and I'm sure we'll dig more into all of those elements as we go along.
We no doubt will. Thank you. Okay, well, let's get our guest, Keith, in. So, Keith, you were a financier to the hydrocarbon industry. What do you think? Is climate finance, does it have does it have influence?
I think the laws of physics apply. The equal and opposite effects are there, that finance created and facilitated. It's the foundation of the climate crisis. Without finance, there were no robber barons. Without finance, there's no J.P. Rockefeller. There's no pipelines. The hydrocarbons would stay locked in the earth. So I clearly think they have a role. And my attitude is it's an all hands on deck. So why would you throw the hand, even though it has cufflinks on the cuff, as they reach into the lifeboat? You wouldn't throw them off. You'd bring them on board, because the financial markets control $170 trillion, $170 trillion, which is 8.5 times the GDP of the United States. So to ignore that capital, to look at $10 trillion per year, which is estimated to go into hydrocarbon development, not to recover what's already been discovered, but to produce and develop new reserves per year, and to not try to redirect some of that capital, in some cases, $2 or $3 or $5 trillion of that into expanding the green footprint would be, I would say, criminally naive. Mm-hmm. So I do think they have a role. And the biggest role, of course, from my perspective, that government could play is a carbon tax regime. That's one everybody on this call, I'm sure, is clamoring for, just some certainty, even if you're on the business side of this equation, instead of knowing, having to deal with 171 constituencies in each country, to have one unified, hey, it's $75, it's $150, and this is the deck I'm dealt, and I can make money or not make money doing things I do, or I'll have to improve the way I do things.
Yep. Well, here in Canada, we do have a carbon tax regime, both a tax on consumers and also industrial carbon pricing regimes. It's just that former one is being fought by several provinces in the country right up to the Supreme Court. So, David, I want to get you in. You've been a skeptic on this topic, and I heard you just last night as I was listening into a conversation with some of your students at Harvard sort of say, well, we really should be pushing government regulations, and intimating it could be a distraction. What do you think, climate?
Well, let me first pick up on that conversation last night, actually, because one of the really fun things about teaching at a place like the Kennedy School is there's students who know far more than I do. Folks like Keith, and in this case, some younger people who have been deeply involved in some of the details of climate finance. And I think what I learned that really was interesting is in this movement to build reporting, formal reporting in the end that will be auditable reporting through these ESG metrics there's a much higher level of sophistication than I think I realized. I came in with a kind of arrogant view that I knew something about these details of this environmental input-output life cycle accounting, which is this sector-by-sector way we can break down the whole economy and understand the net, say, CO2 emissions that comes from spending $1 million on entertainment. There's a place, EIO, LCA at CMU, can look that up, and it's quite accurate. I kind of figured, I know this stuff, and the other people in the conversation wouldn't. But I think what I realized is there's much more going on in the details about how these will work. And right now there isn't a auditable way to handle these so-called scope 3 emissions. That's the emissions that come from stuff you purchase. It is amazing the level of material of accuracy that already is going into these. So I'm now a little bit more convinced that there might be some meaning in these detailed accounting, and therefore there's ways for the market to react to it. So that's a plus. I think, actually, to refer back to that class, we recently had Bill McKibben in, which was a thrill. He was one of the first people thinking about divestment. And I think there is, to think about the weaknesses of the idea about climate finance. I think the naive view about the divestment world was somehow that divesting from fossil fuels would prevent fossil fuels happening. That is totally naive on a bunch of dimensions. Obviously, the fact that there's lots of state-owned oil companies that aren't going to the market anyway, but also on some fundamental way that even if some fraction of investors care about green, a bunch of other investors just care about making money. And the bottom line is, if we have a market for oil, people are going to supply that market. And if it gets marginally a little harder to get capital, that just means the prices go up marginally. Big deal. It doesn't change things very much. And that comes back to the underlying thing, that what matters are the fundamental rules that, in the end are set by government around what we're allowed to sell and what not.
Got you. Okay. So I want to come back to a couple points, but first, I always forget. Let's share the poll results. So will it be a plus for Canada's oil and gas sector, the climate finance movement? 45% of you say yes. Will it be a negative? 48% say no. Won't have a material impact on capital flows. 6%. Okay. Keith, you talked about the laws of physics. So let's talk about some of the physics here in Canada, which is appropriate given that we have two.
Sorry, you're asking the plutocratic business guy to tell you about the laws of physics? You've got two actual physicists as co-hosts. Come on, man.
Yeah. Be the Enviro MBA guy too. And we're talking about physics. But the physics is the oil and gas sector in Canada is one of the largest sources of GHG emissions. So 27% of Canada's emissions come from the oil and gas sector. It was 18% in 1990. It's grown steadily since. Transportation is 24%. So when you combine the two, you have plus 50% of Canada's emissions come from upstream oil and gas production, and largely from the combustion of their products on the downstream. So in this case, we know where the problem is. So if climate finance, if you have a pool of capital that cares about this, then how is it not, getting to your point about divestment, or the conversation we had months ago with Peter Tzakian, how is climate finance, when it comes to Canada's oil and gas sector, not fundamentally a divestment play? Just trying to divert capital away from the oil and gas sector to less carbon or zero carbon sectors.
I mean, when you talk about the sands, that's a lot harder to see a pathway for a finance person, because those are major oil companies for the most part. And you're also dealing with Canada's patrimony. So when I look at the efforts made to stop the Keystone Pipeline in the States here, aside from when they tried to go through the Sandhill Range in Nebraska, the motivations there were not to per se to stop the pipeline and its crossings, but to stop and keep in the ground the sand oils in Canada. The short, the intellectual challenge to that, of course, is that Canada, the oil markets aren't only south of Canada, they're east and west as well. So you just would be displacing the pipe to run to the Maritimes or to British Columbia. So I really, I don't have the magic bullet here with respect to these companies, to the extent that they're Shell, to the extent that they're TransCanada, Enbridge, companies that rely on U.S. capital markets. There will be disclosures related to that, and it's not the change in regulatory changes. If BP says we have X reserves, and we believe now we're going to have to leave 30% of those in the ground, and therefore we're taking a write-off of X billions of dollars, these actions do not occur in a vacuum. So like-minded companies have to make similar assessments. The SEC will start looking into security filings. Have you disclosed this risk adequately? Insurance companies will start asking, are you insuring for these types of environmental reclamations? When we look at the coal industry, it isn't that it just grew out of disfavor and that other fuels became cheaper. There were actually OSHA regulations regarding safety. There were land reclamation, there were water waste disposal regulations already on the books that added to the cost of the coal industry. And that on top of it falling out of investor disfavor has created that industry. That industry now, I think, represents less than $30 billion of market capitalization, and employs less than 30,000 people in the United States today. So, I mean, this is, if you're up in the sands, I think you have to look at some of these analogous, when is the Kodak moment? When is the world going to go digital and you're still there with all the film? And, if I'm Canada, if I'm up there and I'm not there, and I love the country, and we all think about ejecting ourselves up there every time for the last 4 years we have. But, if I'm up there, I'm thinking I'm taking what I can right now and doing what the Norwegian Sovereign Fund's doing what Saudi Arabia is doing. Saudi Arabia right now is making the green move, whether you recognize that or not. The sale of Saudi Aramco's shares and offloading that equity to the world is a way for them to put that carbon in their back rearview mirror 100 years from now.
Yeah. They're good at the E side of ESG. Too bad that they suck at the S and G side. But, yeah, I noticed as well, Keith. You keep referring to the sands. Are you purposely avoiding taking a political stance by whether you're going to call it oil sands
or tar?
Sands?
It's the oil sands. The bitumen, as the Germans call it.
Yeah, the bituminous sands. Yeah. Okay. So, Sara, I'd love to get your take on this. So on one hand, you could see, and by the way, I mentioned Mark Campanelli. You said there are $25 trillion in fixed assets right now in the world tied up in fossil fuel production as the world decarbonizes and electrifies. And yeah, you mentioned the BP example, Keith. Very few companies are really taking those write-downs. But the companies, so the ones up here, and Keith, you mentioned Shell or Suncor or other companies, they want to be part of the transition. They need capital to do that. And capital right now is very hard to come by. And it's especially hard to come by if you want to invest in current assets. It's easier to come by if you want to fund your hydrogen project, or we hope the carbon capture project. It's harder to come by if you want to fund current assets, which is where we need to go if we want to really reduce emissions. So are we in this kind of no man's land right now of you can't get that capital to deal with the emissions that we really need to address? But Sara, what's your take on it?
So, I mean, I think that goes back to actually something we talked about quite a few shows ago, this question around, what's the play in decarbonizing the existing production? I mean, in general, your question of, is it a divestment play? I think that there is a temporal component to the answer of that, right? If you go back 10 years ago when this discussion, was really heating up 10, 15 years ago, I think it wasn't necessarily a divestment play to say, climate finance, there was a lot of energy behind the idea of investing in ways to reduce the footprint of oil production. I think that now, as we're moving to a world where, there's general agreement that there are significant reserves globally that will need to remain in the ground if we are going to, be on a livable planet in the future, right? I think that's no longer a particularly strong statement to make. And so in that world, I think to some extent, divestment, certainly from the resource, yes. Then, is it divestment from those companies? I guess it's a question of to what extent they bring a compelling story to investors and what investors see as alternatives for their money to go into. So, I'm interested to hear, Keith's take as someone who sits in the US and can speak to this, but I think that still that idea of, convincing investors that there is an opportunity to lower the footprint of emissions of oil in Canada, I increasingly feel like that is not a very compelling argument anymore. And it's something that we're still a little bit stuck on. Whereas, we can argue about why we got to that point. The one other point that I wanted to make, actually coming back a little bit to your, what's the physics of it? So I'll do the reverse. I'll be the physicist who talks about her epiphany when I left physics. And I still remember, my first kind of days with McKinsey, somebody I think sat me down, and explained like, this is the way that, businesses make decisions, and it's not always, completely logically based, right? The economist model of perfectly rational actors is not really totally correct.
Oh, McKinsey isn't quite the same as the physics lab, eh?
Yeah, exactly. So that was like mind blowing for me. I remember like it was, totally changed my worldview. But I think that's a really important part of this climate finance discussion and why the divestment movement, I agree. And I think we could debate a little bit about how much the cost of capital can accelerate things, because especially if you're talking about, lowering the relative cost of capital for clean tech that is maybe has higher upfront costs, I think you can, get a bit of difference going there. But I actually think that really just raising the awareness and forcing investors to kind of confront their underlying assumptions is a really like the biggest stick that climate finance has to bring. Yep. And especially, when you get to the point where we are now, where you have some history and you can show that, previously investments that were made into lower carbon sectors over the past few years have performed better. You could say, well, okay, but that should be obvious. You could have figured that out without having that discussion. But still, I mean, investment is a community, and it's a community of people who have a certain set of biases and beliefs. And so I think that's where we're starting to see the impact of climate finance actually playing out more strongly in the allocation of capital as a result.
Gotcha. Yeah. David.
Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry.
No. Well, so a question, love to get David back in. So with divestment, if capital is harder to come by and it's exerting pressure at the same time, if you look at the oil and gas sector is responsible for a tremendous amount of patents, innovation, and then, commercialization far more than any other sectors. So what part of my concern is if you start to bleed it of capital as using the stick approach, that we're going to lose a lot of spin-off technologies that can be going in to other sectors to help them drive down emissions. Like, let's face it, carbon capture, we all work on in varying degrees. has been driven in Canada largely by the oil and gas sector. We hope with tremendous spin-off benefits to other sectors, because all paths to net zero in Canada, with mid-century decarbonization legislation set to be announced today, may already have been announced, all those pathways go through carbon capture, and the oil and gas sector has been leading that. David, you're frowning like a physicist.
I'm somewhat skeptical about this technology spin-offs, but I want to stick to finance and not technology for this session, and really think about the push and pull. And so I think ultimately the way this finance most has impact is through politics. So my model of the way the world works in this is, in the end, businesses will make money doing stuff that there's a market for, the government allows them to do. So if you're allowed to sell fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are going to be cheaper than renewables in lots of applications for a long time, not every application. Fundamentally, it's government setting the rules for things that shapes the market. But what rules the government sets is a political decision. And there's ways in which finance interacts strongly with politics. And what you're seeing now is it interacting on both ends. So the divestment movement is, I think the sensible version of the divestment movement is about trying to weaken some political power of the fossil fuel industry and lobbying. It's not that you're really going to take away all the money, because in the end, people need to fill their cars while we still have gas cars, and the market will clear. Capitalism works. But now what you're seeing is the other side of green finance that is identifying companies that are green in the sense that have low emissions. It makes those companies a little marginally easier to raise capital, but more importantly, it makes people who own that capital stock, that set of rich people who have power, more able to exercise that power in favor of carbon pricing or regulations. So in a sense, part of what green finance does is a way for politically the forces that are going to gain from strong government regulations that in the end prevent us using the atmosphere as a waste dump for our carbon. The forces that are going to gain from that have a way to know who they are and be politically organized. And that's the way in which finance lubricates both ends of the fight, the anti-fight and the pro-fight, what we don't want and what we do want.
Gotcha. Okay. Then I want to pick up on an example that you talked about with Keith and your students yesterday. So that could apply to oil and gas. Let's step aside from oil and gas for a second. Let's talk about national pizza chains. And you've got a national pizza chain. You have Pizza Hut that has a lower carbon footprint than Joe's Pizza. Is that going to really confer any advantage onto Pizza Hut when all people really care about is having tasty pizzas? So maybe to oil, although purely speculative, if people, in spite of Shell's announcements earlier this week or last week about giving drivers the option to make their emissions carbon neutral through kind of offsets we talked about with Mark Tursick, does it apply to other sectors? Does it make any difference?
I think the answer is it might in two dimensions. I mean, so one answer is if marketing matters and people are green consumers and Joe's Pizza is beside Pizza Hut and it's sort of public that Joe's Pizza is high carbon, you're going to get some green people who want to go to Pizza Hut, but maybe you're going to get some kind of anti-green people, because they exist, who are going to want to go to Joe's Pizza. But I think the other impact is if it's therefore easier for Pizza Hut to raise finances, and they know that will incent them to try and do better by their purchase agreements, because this is really about who they purchase electricity from, or what fleets they hire to deliver their pizzas. Or what meat they're buying to put on the pizzas, meat and cheese. All that supply chain stuff is the stuff that matters, and it basically incents them to keep their share price up to make supply agreements that are greener, and that pushes through to new technologies.
Gotcha. Yep, Keith. Let's talk about an example again came from last night, Anwar. So Anwar, because it's very topical in that President Trump has reopened or is now on the cusp of issuing permits to oil and gas companies to drill in Anwar, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. So some companies don't want to touch those bids. Other companies, frankly, don't care. What is really going to drive protection of that? Is it just going to be straight up regulation? Is it going to be Joe Biden coming in and making drilling in Anwar off limits? Is it going to be protection of caribou? Or ultimately, is finance and capital going to catch up and punish those companies who don't care about the environmental implications from putting in bids? And before I hand it to you, I will say I was in The Hague and Shell in a meeting with Shell right up to the CEO, Ben Van Beurden, years ago, when Shell had just decided not to drill in the Arctic. And it was hailed as a terrific triumph by the environmental community. And Shell actually played up some of the environmental reasons for why it decided to not drill. The reality was it drilled a dry hole. It was fundamentally for business reasons that they decided not to drill there. But Keith, let's hear you.
No, an environmentalist's best friend is $25 a barrel oil and $2 an M gas, because these high, hard to get to reservoirs have more costs associated with them. And there's nothing, the Exxon Valdez, which is not drilling, but transporting, rocks and oil-coated birds. These are things that companies don't want to have associated with them, because even Lee Raymond has children. So, you have to look at that. But specific to ANWR, the majors aren't going to show up because the price decks aren't there, number one. And that doesn't mean if the lease sale comes, if you hold it, they will come. So there already are on the books requirements to bid in that area. You have to have a certain capital structure and certain experiences. So that limits the pool further. So, I used the example last night of a mid-continent oil producer who's very friendly to this administration. Quite honestly, he couldn't show up there unless they modified those rules. But so let's assume the auction occurs on January, whatever it occurs. There is a bidder. The bid is a fraction of whatever the last Arctic sale was. So the Department of Interior is not running around going, oh, whoopee-doo, look at us, we raised $500 million. You're not going to do that. But then what the president has in his toolkit is a whole bunch of controls with executive orders. And it could be as direct as changing the mind, but it could be, we all of a sudden just change the regulations with respect to pipeline or navigable removal of hydrocarbons from that area. There's so many buttons to push. I used the caribou migration standards last night, but there's a lot of things that could happen. The change in the permafrost and all of that could be looked at from a scientific perspective. From the last time the leases, I'm not sure, but I think the last lease sale in the Arctic was in the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not positive, but there's a lot less permafrost there now, 40 years later. So I think it's a change in circumstances as well. So I'm not worried about that project going through. I think it's just it's an empty promise, an empty sale. And by the way, the lease sale proceeds are going to be so de minimis anyway that the government would just hand them back. So there'd be no harm, no foul. There wouldn't be no litigious aspect to this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like another piece of Trump grandstanding, that like red meat to the base, but it's meat that really is not mostly gristle.
Right.
That's continued the metaphor, meats that's seen its best days, that is festering away. David, we should give a shout out to our mutual friends, Carson Hoyer and Leanne Allison, because if you care about ANWR, you should read Carson's book, Being Caribou, and watch Leanne's film, NFB film, National Film Board film, Being Caribou as well. Terrific exploration of the issue. Okay.
You're here. For you U.S. audiences, if you haven't seen Being Caribou, it's a must-see.
Yeah. We want to start going to questions. Do we have Alan Slavin ready? And so,
okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Alan. The floor is yours. Let's hear about your financial advisor.
Okay, so my question is this. We've got a financial advisor who's associated with one of the major banks. And just this week, like about 5 days ago, well, we've been bugging him for some time to go renewable. We divested from fossil fuels about 2 years ago, and our portfolio has been substantially outperforming the stock market, the TSE. And he told us about 3 days ago that he's decided that he's going to only advise people to go into renewables from now on, that he sees that's where the growth is, that fossil fuels, at least the tar sands, are losing proposition. And if you look at the stock market values, they've gone down, 50% since their peak. And renewables have gone up typically something like 10 or 15%, although other ones like Vestas Wind Power has gone up probably 30 or 40% since February. So I think he's making a wise decision. But my question was, how common is this kind of switch for financial advisors?
Sara, do you want to jump in? And I'm wondering if you can give a shout out to Blake Schaefer's study, which just was newsworthy today.
Good point. So the policy school at the University of Calgary put out a sort of summary of what's going on around prices for solar and just the falling costs. And I think that all feeds into this same narrative around the business case for some of these low carbon solutions. And so I think what Alan was describing is becoming more and more common. And I think to me, that's the classic example of how that early wedge of the divestment, which sort of makes people aware of this, and look at those returns for the, lower carbon versus higher carbon, for example, then translates into real action at a larger scale where, you can, I think, even if there is some capital left, the sort of higher cost of that capital and the reduced amount of it does start to make a difference. I think what's interesting, is like, what's the causal direction there? I'm tempted to sort of, in the case of the advisor, to say it's a little bit more of the big banks getting out in front of the parade, right, versus them leading the charge. And so, that, again, as I said, I think there's a mechanism that ties back to the original work around divestment. So they are very much linked. But I think what you have happening now is very much driven by that business model case, which, in a way means that it's going to be more durable against, trying to convince people otherwise, right? The only thing that would start to change that around again would be a dramatic shift in the overall, rates of return for one bucket of companies versus another. So I see that as almost more of a sign that things are changing than an example of climate finance leading the way. But at the same time, it's a very meaningful sign. And I think that's, really what we should be paying attention to. And it is quite important.
Yeah. David, I want to put you on the spot because years ago we had a conversation. I think it was about ethical investments. And you said, well, I could do that, but why wouldn't I just hand my hard-earned money to my investment manager to invest in private equity to maximize returns so then I can then take that money and put it toward environmental good? Has your to put you on the spot, views
I'm okay with that.
Changed?
That pretty much is my personal view. So personally, most of my money is just in pretty vanilla index funds. But the extent that I think about it, I feel like I don't really know how to invest to make money better anyway. But the extent that I think about money seriously, my ultimate use for it, for the extent that I don't need it, is to give it away to environmental activist groups. And I feel like that's a higher leverage thing. So if I've got a choice, for example, one of the few times I did a direct investment is I put a bunch of money to BP stocks right after the oil spill because I figured the company wasn't going to go down, it was going to rebound. And from my point of view, I have no ethical qualms because I give away lots of money to environmental groups and to give directly, which gives money directly to people in the poor world.
Yep. And just watch your inbox fill up now with emails from development directors across the Engo community. You and Jeff Bezos with his announcement today.
Yeah.
It's a good day for Engos in Canada. Yeah.
But I think that is it. I feel like markets are so liquid. Forgetting my tiny little investments, I feel like the question is markets are so relatively liquid, and there's this way that money kind of flows around. And I think the central problem here is that if you set up complicated accounting standards, it's easier for people to game them. So it's very hard to be that confident that your choices have a real impact. Whereas I am really confident that if I give money to give directly, it actually goes to some of the world's poorest. Or if I give money to an environmental group, it goes there. And I'll give you an example of these standards that I've personally done now quite a bit of research on. So many of your listeners will be familiar with the LEED standard for buildings, leadership and environment, and something else. And it turns out that there's basically no correlation or close to no correlation between the LEED rating of a building and its energy performance. And that's actually at this point quite well known, but it still goes on. And my guess is lots of university presidents or big company CEOs or whatever who invest in LEED buildings do so because they sincerely think it's making the biggest environmental problem in our world today, climate, better. And it mostly isn't. And that's because the LEED standard is so complicated with so many different scoring points. That's not clear what it's achieving.
Yeah. Yeah. And I could say the same with the ISO 14001 or 14,000 in certain number standards. It does not confer or imply any kind of a priori improvement in environmental performance.
Yeah.
It can be in its worst incarnations, a checkbox exercise. Okay. Let's go back. Keith, you talked about carbon pricing. We sung the praises of Canada's approach and we puffed up our chests and felt superior to you Americans. Let's go to Robert Tremblay, who is at risk of becoming a fixture on energy versus climate, only because you put such good questions down in our boxes, Robert. So over to you for your question.
Thanks, Ed. So like Ed said, it's the questions about clean energy standards and prices on carbon. So it seems to me like clean energy standards have become quite a bit more popular lately than prices on carbon. So how do you view standards versus the price on carbon when it comes to impacting project financing? Does the incremental price on carbon versus the sort of sunset dates and standards provide better input into the financial system to get low carbon projects built? Thanks.
Keith, can we get you in?
I've never done a transaction with that aspect specifically on it, but the carbon tax obviously is much easier to analyze because your unit of production sales is burdened by a higher cost of goods sold, and therefore your profitability and cash flow is diminished or enhanced. Maybe if Robert could give me an example of what the other side to the carbon tax question is, then I could probably have a little bit better opinion.
Let's try it. So as many of you know, one of the things I did is founded Carbon Engineering, this Canadian direct air capture company that's been pretty successful. And I think a central reason we were able to raise money was one of those standards, the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And I happen to know a bunch about that standard. One of my close colleagues, now departed, was one of the people who helped to set it up and stand beside Schwarzenegger when it was signed, Alex Farrell. And I think the core of that standard basically says you can sell fuels into California, including electricity, by the way, any fuel measured kind of at the drive shaft of the vehicle. You're free to sell fuels, but the total well-to-wheels carbon intensity average is capped. And then it says, capitalism, knock yourselves out. You're free to bring in oil sands fuel as long as you bring in some other low carbon fuel at the edge. And all we, the government, are going to do is regulate down that total. And I think there's something very nice about that as a regulatory system. It allows you to have a high marginal price, now close to $200 a ton, with a low average price, and allows you to do it in a sectoral way. And the argument for the sectoral way is that we know transportation is hard to change, and we didn't want to choose technological winners. We wanted to pick the social goal, which is reducing carbon transportation. And that's part of the reason that Carbon Engineering was able to succeed, is because people hadn't pre-decided DAC made any sense, but the rule was technology neutral. So that's an example of one of these standards.
Yeah, Ed, let me now I'm getting this. Yeah, these types of standards have exist. PURPA, FERC Order 436. Yeah. Government fiat is as a big risk deterrent for financing. So if a stroke of a pen in a legislature can undo a critical component of the economics of a transaction, financiers like myself are always wary of that. And PURPA in the United States created the cogeneration industry. It allowed sales from cogen facilities to be pushed into the electric grid, even though there might have been enough capacity. It's sort of like rooftop solar being pushed into the grid. And so these plants were financed. And then right after Carter left office, Reagan undid PURPA. Yep. And then all of every one of those plants went bust. And then you have the same with FERC Order 436. You were able to build pipelines and recover your take or pay. So I agreed to buy oil or natural gas for $10 an MCF. The market price is $2, but the $8 difference was recoverable in rates. In 1984, the FERC said, no, you cannot recover them. Liabilities in tens and $20 billion took the entire pipeline industry in the United States, which at that time was 45 pipeline companies, consolidated into 18 over the next decade because of the financial insecurities that were created by that. So these are things that banks and lenders and bondholders are aware of. And So it'd have to be more than just a state, in David's example, for somebody to jump in, I think.
But of course, I mean, that applies for carbon pricing as well, too, right? I mean, there's always that political risk.
Absolutely. Unless it's a world standard, and then, sort of gets it sort of embedded. But you're absolutely right. It goes the same way.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on David's example of California's and Oregon's LCFS. So the Keen Energy versus Climate audience members will know that Canada is going to introduce in the form of Canada Gazette 1 its regulations for the equivalent, the clean fuel standard here in Canada. And yet you have the oil and gas companies up here who are working overtime to try to weaken, if not kill, that standard. So at what point, bringing it back to climate finance, at what point does the smart money look at a smart regulatory tool like that, look at the companies and their advocacy against pro-climate legislation, standards, and policies, and start to punish them for some of their actions by withholding finance?
Well, a big component of the BP announcement in February, which went unremarked upon by anybody I saw, was that they were going to pull their funding from people and organizations which lobbied against climate and climate regulations. So they were going to become advocates for a green future. And so in this regard, they would distinguish themselves from the companies you're talking about by taking the other side of this. Now, the payoff, though, comes only when and if, and it hasn't happened yet, of course, that BP starts to become a favored nation investment vehicle vis-a-vis some of these other entities. And so that takes years. That's going to take years. But BP is already doing the right thing, at least with respect to those types of actions you just talked about.
Okay. Let's get
I think it's been slow, right? Like the idea of first, what the companies themselves are advocating for, but then also what organizations are they giving to, what industry associations are they giving to advocate on their behalf. I think, I completely agree, Keith, that's, I think, starting to happen now. I just wanted to point out that's, in a lot of cases still not being really, people aren't necessarily being made aware of it, or companies aren't necessarily losing financing because of it.
And I think it's the core argument that makes ethical sense to me. So in the campus divestment movements, people want to think about it just like South Africa, but I think that's not ethically fair, because there was no reason we couldn't have instantly divested from South Africa because nobody needed apartheid. The fact is, we do need fossil fuels until we build the clean infrastructure that gets us off them. And so we don't actually want fossil fuels to go away tomorrow. What we want from the oil companies is not to lobby against change. We want them to keep producing the stuff we actually need till we don't need it anymore, but we don't want them to buy our politicians to prevent the change. And I think it's really important that divestment focus that way.
Agreed. Okay, let's get another question in from David Shackleton. David's question: are finance people aware that the oil and gas industry is needed for countless downstream products aside from energy, like your Patagonia jackets? And looking at your jacket right now, David. Made by a very anti-oil and gas company like Patagonia. Why is this never discussed when we discuss energy transition? Is it ignorance, or just that the non-energy products are much smaller than fuel production? So why are we giving free passes to the Patagonias of the world when look at the inputs for their products, like that wonderful fleece jacket that David's wearing?
I thought this was grown from special little fleeces that they harvest in some environmental way. No. I think two quick answers. One is it's a very tiny fraction of total fossil flows, a few percent. And the other answer is that the cost of them doing it in a non-fossil way in terms of the product cost is very small. So the cost of me making my car non-fossil, especially in the Alberta environment for long drives where electrics are tough, that's pretty high. It's really quite expensive. It might increases my kind of net ownership cost of a car substantially to force it to be non-carbon today. But the extra cost of Patagonia supplying this from non-carbon alternatives with technological change is going to be pretty small.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, and you're talking, natural gas is still viewed by many as a bridging fuel, and the petrochem business is the NGLs, which are associated with the production of natural gas. Now, I'm not giving natural gas a pass. I think there's a few much low-hanging fruit, but the first set of that is coal, The next set is going to be these, there's going to be the tar sand, it's going to be Arctic production, it's going to be higher risk production. But ultimately, the spotlight's going to come on natural gas. And this is going to be one of the wrestling issues, because the respirators that are saving people's lives, I would suspect that 70 to 80% of the components there are from the petchem business.
Gotcha. So Keith, though, when you were an executive in the hydrocarbon industry or a financier, would you also, because this is the argument I hear, and I understand it when you look at the numbers. The typical oil and gas executive says there's so much of a gaze on us, we're not focusing enough on the downstream. And when you look at the numbers, it's justified, because when I was telling you about Canada's GHGs, 27% coming from oil and gas, 24% comes from transportation. And yet we so often give the transportation side a free pass. And I say that knowing in Canada here, in order to get to our 2030 targets, and if you look at every sector that has to decrease emissions, the cost on a per ton basis in oil and gas is about $120 a ton. That seems really high, given our national carbon tax is going to go up to $50 a ton by 2022. But on the grand scheme of things, it's relatively a cheap ton. The cost to go after a ton in the transportation sector is double that. So you would say then hammer the oil and gas industry because it's the cheaper ton to go for, and therefore the capital should follow. But what was your perspective when you're in the industry?
Well, I was green. I was green because I was natural gas. I was a pipeline guy. I wasn't a producer. So you kind of put yourself in boxes, but you learn as you go along. In fact, I made an LNG faux pas the other day until somebody just basically slapped me inside the head and said LNG is carbon double. You can't put a green brush on anything in the LNG world. So I don't disagree. I think that you have to personalize all of these things, and I think the one that struck me was when California, when I was living out there, proposed a $5 per gallon gasoline tax, which everybody in my neighborhood, which abutted Malibu and Santa Monica, and everybody was like, this is a great idea. And we were talking about this while we were drinking our coffees with our Range Rovers next to us. And because that wasn't going to impact our lives at all, $6.80 gas, no problem. But then we started to look at our home, and we started to think about the people that serviced our homes, the people that taught our children, the people that protected our house from fire, from crime, and we thought about where they actually had to live to service these neighborhoods, and we realized it was the most regressive action of all time. And so when we talk about climate disproportionately impacting those at the bottom end of the pyramid with respect to health and color and gender and all the other aspects that are part of the inequitable world that we live in, going all green really fast without paying attention to the impacts is just as bad as a sea level rise of 4 feet, which displaces 22 million Bangladeshis. So I think you have to be aware of this. If you have to have a conscience, you have to listen to all sides. One shoe does not fit all.
Okay, Sara, over to you.
So I just wanted to pick up on, I can't let David's comment about the EV being really expensive lie, but it actually, it links to something that I wanted to mention that happened in the US this week, which was there was an alliance between some EV manufacturers, the auto industry, and utilities going to Washington saying, we want to lobby to have I think it's zero emission vehicle standard by 2030, I think is where they're at. And this is actually really important. I think, again, ties back to the point that we've been talking about that David made earlier, that also a lot of what the finance is about the political power that is behind that money. And so the reason that this is so meaningful is that, it represents a big shift from what was happening previously, where, the utilities and the oil and gas sector were sort of hand in hand, and oil and gas was hand in hand with, conventional transportation vehicles, to lobby to slow down the standards for cars. There's a natural, if you're a utility, an electric vehicle is a natural demand source for you and a way to sell more of your product. So, it's not a big leap, but it's taken this long to get there. And I think that just comes back to, this question of, so are people unaware that we need, oil and gas for transportation today and for other things later? Sure. I mean, there's some people out there that are saying things like we should turn off the taps tomorrow, and that's just, that's a different conversation. But I think that the idea that there isn't room to really, move forward and build the infrastructure that we need to dramatically reduce the amount of oil and gas that we're using, the extent to which that is the case, is only because there is a lot of money going into keeping it that way. And that as we, start to divert money into those new solutions and finance, because, that's where the capital flows come from, then I think you can see those changes happening more quickly.
Got you. Well, let's continue on that. And we have a question from Annie Berube, who I think has had to drop, but I'm going to read it. Is there an opportunity cost to raising CapEx for marginal emissions reductions in oil and gas? And she says, including for large carbon capture projects, rather than raising capital needed for geothermal, wind, solar, green hydrogen, etc. So an opportunity cost relative to what you're saying, just investing in the infrastructure that we know we will need to get to eventually.
Yeah, I think there might be. And I think this is where we want the green finance to get laser specific, because there are places where CCS, both on some oil and gas and on cement, is going to be cheaper than some other alternatives for cutting emissions. And we need a way to incent that. And just pointing to our next show, which will be about nuclear with former head of our Green Party, I think it is important to say we keep saying about just fossil versus renewables. But remember, we do have another way to make primary energy that's carbon free.
Which is?
Nuclear power.
Yeah. Got you. Okay. Keith, Sara, do you want to weigh in?
No, I think that Sara and everybody have made these points that, the finance, if you lend $1 or invest $1, you want at least $1 and a little bit of return back. So altruism puts an investment thesis on your radar screen, but it doesn't make you press the button to release the funds. Financiers are not in the business of picking winners and losers. So wind and solar are winners. Carbon capture done by a major oil company that's capturing adjacent carbon and re-injecting it into reservoirs that it controls and sealing those reservoirs, that's a proven vehicle. But when you start going to direct air capture and other more scientific experiment aspects, that's for venture capital, and those flows are not really in that $170 trillion pool that I was talking about. And the real capital that gets attracted or distracted by divestment issues and all of that is not in that field. So it depends on really what. The specific aspect, the specific use of proceeds that you're talking about. But we don't pick winners. I mean, batteries is the number one scenario I use. I mean, there's so many battery projects out there. I can't imagine a traditional lender other than somebody that's doing the Tesla, which is vertically integrated. Panasonic is their partner. Tesla is the end user, and they're actually using the batteries to power their own plants and then using that technology to put in their own cars. So it's sort of a full loop. You would finance that all day long.
Yeah. No, but if government is getting into the business of forcing disclosure, and we've got our second question now, which is on a related topic, is government, or they're now trying to create mechanisms around green bonds or transition bonds, is government in effect not picking winners?
No, I disagree that they're forcing disclosure. These rules, what the SEC was looking at, and maybe down the road you could have Jay Clayton or Bill Hinman, who both are resigning at the end of the year, come on your show. But what the SEC is advocating is for uniformity in disclosure. So they're saying, hey, if you're saying that you've done something that's reduced carbon, first off, let's talk in the same terms. Are we talking pounds of carbon, pounds of CO2? Are we talking kilowatt hours? Are we talking gigajoules? So they're talking about conformity. So when you read one annual report, the same information's in the other. They tried to do this with executive salaries, as you know. So the rules and disclosure have always had the MD&A section where management is free to discuss things that keep them up at night and things that excite them. There's no rules around that. And what you're seeing in the MDAs is companies like Shell and Eni and Total are saying, hey, there is a threat to our industry as we know it. And here's what we're thinking might have to happen. Well, you cannot operate in a vacuum. If that disclosure is in 5 major oil companies, what is Chevron going to do? What is Exxon going to do? They're going to have to do it. And once they're doing it, then it goes down to the next level where the marathons and everybody else has to follow the leader. So there's a catalytic, and I know that's a word that's probably popped up in this podcast forever, and whenever you talk about impact investors, but catalytic actions are what we're really addressing here with respect to disclosures.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. Sara, last word to you in terms of one takeaway from today's episode.
Yeah, I think I'll use that last question to, reflect on the idea of opportunity cost and, to what extent, certainly government funding, I think has a clear opportunity cost and it's limited against the scale of things government could put it towards. I think the broader finance community, as we've talked many times during this show, there is a lot of money out there to fund all kinds of things. And so the question of climate finance, I think, is less around, is there really enough money available or money flowing out in terms of money on its own, but it's really how the finance interacts with the politicians, with the broader public, and how the decision makers within the finance sector are influencing each other to make decisions around where their money flows. So when we talk about climate finance, it's the money, but it's the system in which the people and the money operate as well too. So I think we've heard that things are definitely changing, and we're seeing that reflected in the decisions of some of these financial advisors. And I think it's something that Canada and Alberta really needs to pay attention to and realize is going to impact us in a big way.
Words to end on. Thank you, Sara. So just housekeeping. Actually, our last poll. Bottom line is most of you out there, about half, think that Canada's oil and gas companies are laggards when it comes to disclosure and transparency. That's interesting. Our next show is on Friday, December 4th at 1 p.m. Mountain, 3 p.m. Eastern, same start time as today. It's going to be on the pros cons of nuclear power with former Green Party of Canada leader Elizabeth May. You won't want to miss that. Feedback to energyversusclimate@gmail.com. And 3 thanks. 1 to our producer, Eva Wojnijescu, to our webinar superb assistant, Mika McFarlane, and especially to our guest today, Keith Forman. Thank you. You were a wonderful guest. We're very privileged to have you on the show today. That's it, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Wojnijescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.substack.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.